Hi, everyone. Uh, Welcome back to Principles of Management. Today's chapter three. We are looking at how the corporation thinks of the environment and the culture. So, typically, we will probably just discuss a few external environments and internal environments. So, let's begin with the external environment. So, what do we consider the external environment? So, what we're trying to figure and trying to understand is the change in behavior in the external environment. And there are four things that makes up the external environment, according to this book: environmental change, environmental complexity, resource scarcity, and uncertainty. Let's take a look at a few of those in a little bit more detail. So, for environmental change, it's this basic idea of the rate of change at which the environment is looking at. Is it stable or is it dynamic? So, technically, that's the base idea. So when is it stable? The environment itself is stable, which means there is not a lot of change or fluctuation or movements in the change in the environment. And just to give you a broad definition of what I mean by environment, we're talking about the organization and where it lives. So, for example, if it's in United States, particularly say New York or New Jersey or somewhere in that metropolitan region, the things that's going on outside of the organization, such as probably culture or the economy or technology, those things make up that environment according to it. On the internal side of it, where it could be just be workers, management, again, culture, that also makes up the environment. That's internal. So for the basically, so for the environmental change, we're thinking of are those changes that's happening, are they stable, or which means they're probably once every year or once every 5 years, as opposed to is it dynamic where it's pretty frequently happening every couple of months, every 3 months, or somewhere in that regards. So then we think of the environmental complexity, which is just the number of external factors in the environment that affect the organization. So in terms of, in this case, it's not change, it's not the rate of change, it's the number. So are there 100 things going on, or are there just two, three? So basically, is it simple or is it complex? Are we looking at 1,000 things that are happening? Or are we looking at 100 things that are happening, or 20 things that are happening? Again, relative to the country, right? Because different countries might be different. Uh, then we look at resource scarcity. So what we're trying to figure out in that resource scarcity is in the organization and its environment that is operating, especially the external environment, do they have a lot of resources or is it scarce? Which means, do they have a lot of money, capital, land, good workers, all of those things, or is it really scarce? That will, again, allow them to think about what is this concept of in terms of how does it affect the organization and where are we doing business. So we can think of this in two ways: general versus specific. And this chart kind of just depicts some of the things in terms of the general. They're looking at the technology, political, legal, like I mentioned, the economy, social culture trends, while more specific would dive deep into the industry regulators, the suppliers, the competition, the customers, other organizations, basically that you're thinking about. And last but not least, but other groups that are trying to impact them in terms of doing things that are better. So when we think of these components, again, this is just giving you a different look at it. So the question then becomes, when we look at the economy, is it growing? Is it shrinking? Can we predict future activities around the economy? Do we know and understand, or we can find resources where we can look at certain business indices to see how are these things working? Technology, how are we thinking about it? So what are the inputs? What are the outputs? Is the technology itself as the tools, are they changing dramatically? Are they changing fastly? Are they pretty stable? Well, most of us can probably say with a big certainty, around the world, technology is changing very drastically today, given the advent of all of the tools that we see, the technology tools that we see, such as AI, blockchain, all these new things, drones that are happening. So when we move on to social cultural trends component, again, we can see big shift happening around the world when we look at social cultural components, demographic changes, changes in behavior, attitudes, and beliefs, drastically and happening pretty quickly in most cases. So this is a chart that's giving you a quick demographic shift. We're not going to like dive into this, but just to give you an example. And then again, when we think of political legal components, regulatory issues, legislation, court decisions, I would probably argue that at least in the United States and probably other developed countries, they're pretty reasonable understanding around what these people can actually understand it. And in most cases, even if they're pushing it forward, people have the recourse to push back at it and at least understand it before the decision goes into play. So managers should educate themselves on these laws. They don't have to be experts, but they should try to at least understand what's happening relative to their company and especially their industry. And then when we look at the specific, like we mentioned, environment, customers, competitors, suppliers, industry, regulators, advocacy groups, what we want to basically understand is how are we looking at our company? Are we really customer centric? I would argue that most companies today are really customer centric, and if they're not, they should. Um, but also, are you being proactive or reactive? Are you basically monitoring so that you can anticipate problem and trend, or are you responding to the problems and trends? Then we think of our components. We're always, because we're not doing business in a vacuum, so we're always thinking of our components. Competitive analysis, who are they? How do we anticipate their move? How do we determine their strengths and weaknesses? So all these things we're trying to understand around our competitors and doing a job in terms of just creating competitive analysis to examine some of these things. We also want to understand our suppliers because it's important to understand our suppliers. So which side of it we're on? Are we supplier dependent, which means are we dependent on our supply and therefore it's probably cost us more, or are we basically a buyer and therefore we slightly control some of the power? The two basically just looking at opportunistic behavior versus a relationship behavior and just trying to figure out how can we find a synergistic operational with our suppliers. And then there's, like we said, industry regulators that we have to always basically understand, negotiate with, at times, making sure that we can at least benefit, if not mitigate some of the industry regulations that might come our way by having meaningful discussion with them, best practices, all these things. And then your advocacy groups, these are groups that are trying to get companies to do better in certain things related to their business practices, might affecting, when we refer to the environment. In this case, we're talking about things like the water, such as probably the ocean, the animals, all of those other things that are exist in our environment that doesn't really directly affect our business or be a part of our business, but they're part of our global world as we could look at it. So they put pressure on them to different things, boycott, sorry, all those things to basically get us as a corporation to be better citizens. So the case we try to do this with is like trying to understand how do we make sense of this changing environment, and pretty much the tools that we're looking at is environmental scanning. Once we interpret the environmental factors, and then how do we act on the threats and the opportunities. And the reason why we mention threats and opportunity in this case, because we're still thinking of the external environment. And we'll talk more about that later to kind of determine why external environments is so linked to threats and opportunities. So, so for us to be able to interpret the environmental factors, they use the terminology environmental scanning, which just means basically, whatever means necessary, which is either still reading the newspaper or you're online scrolling through multiple sites all over the world, or you're on your phone. You're trying to just understand what's going on, what issues, events, all those things can affect the organization. So you're keeping trying to be current events, trying to be current on the information that are there. It helps you reduce uncertainties, think of certain strategies as you go along, whether you need to change or you need to stay with it. And in the end, in most of this, if you do it well, it should contribute to organizational performance. So that's basically interpreting those factors to see, okay, if we interpret this well, is it an opportunity for us or is it a threat? So we are trying to determine what are those things that we're seeing coming in the environment when we're scanning and looking for this. And then we're asking ourselves, okay, is this an opportunity? Where do we see opportunities? Or is this a threat? And where do we mitigate those threats? So when we act on those, they're typically talking about, creating a mind map and a cognitive map. So people say mind map or cognitive map. And the idea is just basically just creating, something that just helps you look at what's going on, look where your competitors, what's going on in the economy, what type of regulation changes are taking place. Are these good? Are these bad? Where are the opportunities? Where are the threats? And so they call it a cognitive map. And you can see they're looking at the external factors, potential strategies, company strengths and weaknesses, and most of the time you could do this in a relative to your competitor or competitors. They're more than one. Then once we move from the external, we start looking at the internal factors, and this explain the organizational culture and the things that are happening within the organization. Um, Basically, that whether it's finance, whether it's worker behavior, whether it's cultural norms. So we think about those things and we ask ourselves, what is going on in the organization, and can we find, in terms of management, employees, culture, how do we create attitudes and share beliefs so that these things are run effectively? And what mainly you see occur from this is that the culture is usually created by the company's founder. Again, it's flexible because there are changes going on over here. And it's created through stories, through organizational areas where people are making the case as to um, why this particular company is the way it is, through these companies. So, and we kind of see it or get a sense of it, at least in some part today, because we see most of those companies are being built and founders are still there. And typically, successful organizational culture, it's consistent, there's a clear vision, it's involvement, which means it's work to include everyone, and it's adaptable, right? Because it will change with time. Things are changing so fluidly, so it's important that they're adaptable. And you can see there are different levels of this organizational culture where people can see what's going on, they can hear it, and basically believe that these things are happening, or based from that assumption. So, changing organizational culture, typically, there are certain things that you're trying to do. You're add to the behavior, you're substituting the behavior, or you're looking to change artifacts such as the design or the layout of the company. So you'll see that sometime, right, when company trying to change their culture, or who they are, how the world perceive them, they might change the layout or design of of the offices. The dress code potentially could change. And we see that sometime, basically. So that's how we go about doing that. Like I said, substitute, changing managers, employees, all those things, or adding new things to it, adding new employees, changing the CEO, just to redefine the organizational culture. So that covers chapter three, basically. Again, Always a pleasure talking to you guys. Basically, I look forward to our next chapter, chapter 4. Hope you have a great day. Thank you and bye.